All right, well, thanks for inviting me and thanks for braving the inclement weather. Um, my book, Unsettled Land from Revolution to Republic, The Struggle for Texas, came out last year, in the summer of last year. Um, and let me start by saying, telling you a little bit about what the book is not, okay? I'll get to what the book is about in a minute, but it's not about the Alamo. And when I pitched the book to BASIC, which is a New York trade press, I said, there's a lot more going on in Texas in the 1830s than a 13-day siege at the Alamo. And they said, great. We didn't know that. Write that book. So I got to work, and about 3 years later, I was in the editing process, and I got an email from the art department, and they said, here's your cover, the cover art for the book. We hope you like it. And so they sent it to me on a Friday afternoon at like 5 o'clock New York time. And so I clicked on the PDF, and to my horror, I saw an image of the chapel of the Alamo, famous Alamo Chapel, with smoke rising from the walls. That was going to be the cover for the book. And I had it was an anxious weekend. And first thing Monday morning, I spoke to my editor. I said, this will not do. I have 4 pages on the Alamo, and the book's about 400 pages long. So if anything, it's false. It would have been false advertising. And they understood. And I shouldn't make fun of the art department at BASIC. I give this talk a lot, and every time I do, I start with making fun of the art department. I feel badly because I love what they came up with the second time. I love this cover. But even in New York, not just Texans, I tell that story because even in New York or anywhere else in the country, when you think about the Texas Revolution, you think about the Alamo. Maybe you think about San Jacinto or Goliad. We have this really fixed view, sort of calcified view, if you will, this calcified view of what Texas is like in the 1830s. And we've told this story again and again and again, kind of ad nauseum for about 125 years. I'm sort of at the end of my career now, and when I was in grad school, I had the opportunity to teach 7th grade history for about a year. And that's how I really got interested in Texas history, teaching at the 7th grade level. I love Texas history. I wasn't too keen on teaching 7th graders, I got to say. So I only did it for a year. But I became fascinated with this period, the 30s and the Republic period into the 1840s, before Texas becomes a state. And the book that I used, so I'll tell you, this was in the 80s. The book that I used in the 80s has changed hardly at all. We're still telling students exactly the same story over and over and over again. And maybe, and I know some of you, because I spoke to you at the beginning, are familiar with a kind of a counter narrative, if you will, to the traditional heroic narrative. And it was a book called Forget the Alamo, which came out about 2 years ago now. And Forget the Alamo is an interesting book. And if anyone's, wants to ask me a question during the Q&A, I'll be happy to answer. But it still focuses on the same cast of characters. Whether you lionize Sam Houston, Davy Crockett, Jim Bowie, and so on, or you demonize them as sort of self-motivated slaveholders, you're still focusing on the Alamo. You're still focusing on this one event and the sort of the military side of the Texas Revolution. The same cast of characters, James Walker Fannin, Stephen F. Austin, and so on and so forth. And so what I wanted to do in Unsettled Land was tell a very, very different story. And I teach Texas history every year, and have done since I started. I think I'm 30 years ago. And when I teach it, I try to explain to students that Texas is one of the most ethnically diverse places in North America in the 1830s. And you would never think that if you were in a 7th grade class. You would never think that this is one of the most ethnically diverse places, but in fact it is. Let me just give you an example of what I'm talking about. In the 18th century, There are very few people here in the 1700s, early 1700s. You have indigenous tribes, the Karankawas along the coast, and you have the Caddos. Caddos have been decimated by disease. And then you have, in the early 1700s to mid 1700s, you have this migration from the west and the northwest of semi-nomadic or nomadic tribes, the Comanches and the Apaches. And then you have a nomadic tribe, the Wichitas, coming down from Kansas, but the mid 1700s. And at the same time, New Spain is building missions. Familiar with the mission system if you've been to San Antonio. The Alamo was originally one of those 5 missions. So this complex of missions throughout Texas, and then later civil settlements, and that's all in the 1700s. And then in the 1800s, it gets more interesting still, because in the early 1800s, you begin to see Native American refugees from the United States coming in. And if you've been up to the Peace Circle, just up the road here, then you know that there are a lot of tribes that the Houston administration is negotiating with in the 1840s. All of those statues, I think there are 11. Houston is the 11th, and there's 10 Native American signatories. Is that right? Those are all immigrant tribes. Cherokees, Choctaws, Chickasaws, Shawnees, Delaware, off the top of my head. They are all peoples who have been coming in from the early 1800s on, starting with the Alabama Cushadas, who come in the early they have been arriving in 1802, as far as we know. And one of the things that I really liked about the Peace Circle project, when Sally Andrews got me on board, was that we tend to conflate the Native American experience. And we think about Indians, Indians. We just call them Indians, and that's all we need to know. If you go up to the Peace Circle project, the Peace Circle up the road, then you know, if you're paying attention, that these are 10 distinct groups, okay? Linguistically, culturally. Think of them as micro societies. It's kind of hard for us to get our heads around that, but that's exactly what they are. And those Native Americans could not communicate with each other, much less the nomadic Athabascan-speaking tribes from the West. They used Pidgin English, and they used Pidgin Spanish, and sometimes they used sign language. Cherokee language is distinct from the Algonquin language, which some of the tribes spoke. And so these are very, very different peoples. So already by the early 1800s, you have this really complex mix of peoples. And then Anglos come. And Anglos begin to, not only do Anglos come, but some bring enslaved African Americans. But the enslaved population is more complicated than you might think, because cotton prices spike in the mid-30s, and it's very, very difficult for slaveholders who want to expand their acreage, put more cotton, more land into cultivation, to capitalize on the price of cotton rising. It's very difficult for them to expand their labor force. So what happens is you see this really lucrative slave trade, slaves being smuggled into the Brazos River Valley from Cuba. And these are not African Americans. These people are Yoruba-speaking Africans from the Niger River Delta, who had endured the Middle Passage, the horrors of the Middle Passage, only a few months earlier. They didn't speak English. They didn't speak Spanish. They couldn't even communicate with African American overseers. So it's a complicated story. And by the 40s, you may know, we begin to see migrants from Central Europe, Germans in particular. And so this is a really diverse population. And we're not telling that story at the 7th grade, I can tell you. And most people who go to the Alamo don't get that story, or any of these other sites. And so that's the story that I wanted to tell in Unsettled Land, I wanted to look at all of these people. And we've known since I was in grad school that this was an Anglo-centric narrative. 30 years ago, 35 years ago, we knew this was an Anglo-centric narrative, really focused on Anglo-Americans and the struggle for Texas. And to rectify that, what historians did was simply insert people of color into that narrative and then kind of call it a day. So like, well, you know, let's talk about Juan Seguin, because Juan Seguin was at the Battle of San Jacinto and a friend of Sam Houston. And so, you know, what I wanted to do was not just tell their story with respect to, you know, how their story relates to the Anglo-American experience, but to tell their story separate and apart from the Anglo-American experience. Because if you want to study Tejanos, you have to study them as a group. If you want to understand Cherokees, you have to understand them as a group. Comanches, understand them as a group. And then sort of knit those different stories together and come up with a new narrative. And so that's what I tried to do here. It looks very, very different from the traditional narrative, I have to say. And to be honest, when I pitched the book to BASIC, I tried to explain, well, you know, this is going to be a very, very different story because we're going to talk about all of these different people. But when I finished it, I was shocked at how much the narrative had changed. I put my lectures online in 2016, and I go back and I look at them now and I think, boy, they're so hopelessly dated, because even in 2016, I think before I started this book, the narrative that I was imparting to students was still fairly traditional. And anyway, so that was the point of the book. I wanted to talk about all of these different people. And I'm going to give you 3 examples quickly of how the narrative changes, the traditional narrative changes, if you adopt a wider lens, if you look at people other than the Anglo-American, you know, alpha males that we've been told about, all right? Sam Houston and Jim Bowie, Davy Crockett, and so on. Davy Crockett, by the way, and I've got nothing against Davy Crockett. I like Davy Crockett, and he was a really interesting congressman, by the way, in the Tennessee, his Tennessee career is really quite interesting. But he is here 9 weeks before he dies at the Alamo. So if he's a Texan, let's call him an honorary Texan, okay? But I wanted to talk about the people who actually do live here, and that's what the book is about, okay? All right, so I'm gonna give you 3 examples. And where did it go? Oh, there we go. Press down. There we go. All right. Well, Stephen of Austin, we all know who Stephen of Austin is. In the traditional narrative, Stephen of Austin comes to Texas in the early Mexican period, 1821, and he brings the old 300, and then that, before you know it, there's a very thriving colony along the Brazos River, and he becomes this major player in the founding of early modern Texas, as indeed he was. But as I said earlier, Native Americans, refugees from the United States, I call them the immigrant tribes, they're coming in too, and they are coming in larger numbers than the Anglo-Americans, at least at first. They were here first, and they're coming in larger numbers at first. By the 20s, by 1830, I think the Anglo-American population eclipses the immigrant tribes in terms of sheer numbers. But you have to tell that story too. So when my book begins, and for the first 3 chapters, I really talk about the Cherokee experience. I do talk about Austin, but I start with the Cherokees. I could have started with the Alabama Coushatta's. I just didn't know enough about them. We think they came in 1802, but there's very little. There are so few people here in 1802 that we just really don't have a very big sort of primary record of it. But we know the Cherokees come in 1819, in the winter of 1819. And they are led by a man named Chief Bowles. Now, I really would have preferred to have put up on the screen here a picture of another Cherokee leader who's a bit younger than Bowles. He was in his 40s. Bowles was in his 60s when they arrived. But there is no picture of Richard Fields, who came from Tennessee. Bowles came from North Carolina. And Richard Fields was a Cherokee leader who, before any other Native American really, understood the value of legal title, particularly when he begins to find out that Anglo-Americans, like Austin, want to come into Texas. And he's not really sure what their claim. I mean, they have moved in. No one has stopped them. No one can stop them. But they're essentially squatters. They do not have legal title to the land, in the Cherokees' case, between the Angelina and the Neches River, if you know your East Texas geography. That's just north of Nacogdoches. That's where the Cherokees were. The other immigrant tribes, some of them are south of Nacogdoches, some of them are way up just south of the Red River. All of those tribes go to East Texas, but they all settle in different pockets of what is basically a really large area. But Fields understood that they needed to get legal permission from the Spanish and then very soon afterwards the Mexican government if they were going to be able to stay. And so Fields and Bowles go down to Mexico City in the early 20s. They meet Stephen F. Austin because there are a whole gaggle of land agents from the United States who are trying to get Mexico to give them these big, we call them impresario contracts. Austin was by far the most successful of those impresarios, but there was a whole crew of them. And the Cherokees were essentially penniless. They didn't have any money at all. The Mexican government had to pay for their stay and was rather reluctant to do so. And finally, in the end, sends Fields and Bowles packing. It doesn't really tell them, no, you can't have, we're not going to give you official permission to stay, but we'll get back to you. It was very vague what they were told. Don't call us, we'll call you, essentially, is what they were told. And they said, and please don't come back. Let's do it in writing, because they were sick of having to pay for the upkeep of the Cherokees, because it was a fairly large delegation. So they go back, and Fields does something that we still can't really understand. He goes back to the Cherokee villages above Nacogdoches, and he said, boy, that could not have gone better. I've gotten permission from the Mexican government to stay. We're all now secure, and we have valid legal title. And I also now have permission to recruit Native Americans from above the Red River and to bring in as many Native Americans as I can into East Texas. And the Mexican government had explicitly told him, don't do that. And so for the next year or so, he is bringing in Native Americans, recruiting Native Americans, just like Austin is. Now, I get it. Austin has the permission of the Mexican government, and Fields is doing this entirely on the sly. But how many people know who Richard Fields is when we study the founding of early modern Texas? We know who Stephen F. Austin is. We've named the capital after him. There are some gigantic statues to him in this state. But Richard Fields has been lost to history. And so what I wanted to do in those early chapters was tell the Cherokee story of migration and the story of other Indian tribes during this period. It doesn't go well for Fields, I have to say. If you've read I don't know, has anyone ever read Joseph Conrad? I used to love Conrad when I was in college, and if you know Colonel Kurtz or Lord Jim, you know that it does not end well for these men who try to build their empires in the middle of nowhere, Southeast Asia, in the case of Conrad. But basically, that's what Fields is trying to do. He's trying to establish this pan-Indian confederacy, much like Tecumseh had done successfully during the War of 1812. But that clearly is what he's trying to do, because then he sends a letter to the Mexican officials and he says, I'm here I now command 20 tribes. I'm the superior chief of the Indians, which was not a thing. He made that up. There was no such thing as the superior chief of the Indians. And the correspondence of the Mexican officials after they received his letter is really pretty hilarious because they don't know who he is. At least in Nacogdoches and in San Antonio, who is this guy? And they send the letters down to Mexico City, and they do remember him because he had been there 2 years earlier. Is he the guy who we told to go away? Anyway, I'm not going to spoil it for you. I mean, he becomes a major player in the Fredonian Rebellion. And when it becomes clear that he is not going to get legal title as he had hoped, and his dreams of a pan-Indian confederacy come crashing down. Okay, look, I get it. Stephen F. Austin really is an important figure. I'm not trying to take anything away from him. When we have to talk about the migration of Anglo-Americans. The birth of early modern Texas, the Texas that you and I know, starts with Stephen F. Austin. But we have to talk about Native Americans as well. We absolutely have to talk about the migration of thousands of Native American people who would still be here, by the way, if the Texas Revolution had never taken place. Because the Mexican government had never given permission for the Indians to live here. But they didn't have the resources to remove them, and they didn't really have the inclination to remove them either. And so had there never been a Texas Revolution, East Texas would be populated by thousands of Cherokees, Choctaws, Alabama Coushatas. But they are all removed in 1839 by the Mirabeau Lamar government. Okay. So that's just one example, I think, of how a wide lens tells the story differently. We've told the story of Stephen F. Austin. I'm going to go back to this, to mentioning these textbooks that I sometimes refer to because I'm asked to speak at teacher workshops a lot. And I still laugh when I look at these textbooks that talk about Stephen F. Austin, Stephen F. Austin, Stephen F. Austin, Stephen F. Austin. And then there's a sentence, oh, and by the way, Native Americans were coming too. And just a sentence, but chapter after chapter about Stephen F. Austin. So I think we've got that balance wrong, way wrong, and I try to correct it in the first few chapters of the book. Oops, that was the pointer. The second thing, I knew when I was writing the book that I was going to talk about Mexicans who were important in encouraging Anglo migration, because there were some Mexicans who had a vested economic interest in bringing more migrants into Texas because Mexicans weren't coming. And so there were land speculators in Mexico City who sort of paved the way. In many ways, you know, again, we're so focused on Austin. If Mexican elites hadn't helped in Mexico City and at the state level, that Anglo migration would have been cut off, certainly by the early 30s. So Lorenzo de Zavala was a great friend of the Americans. And so I knew I had already planned out several chapters where he was important. And then I got to the Revolution. And I have to say, I thought those are the chapters that really aren't going to do anything that hasn't been done before, because good grief, I mean, how much have we learned? How many books have been written about the Texas Revolution, really? I mean, the battles of the Revolution. Hundreds, scores certainly, hundreds probably. Did I really have anything new to add? Well, what I found was Lorenzo de Zavala was really, really important to this story. And I don't want to get into the weeds here, but his relationship with this man was absolutely key. And Santa Anna, I'm sure you know about Santa Anna. I'm not an apologist for Santa Anna, but I do try to present him as a more complex human being than he is in most traditional Texas histories, where he's just basically a cartoon villain. That's how he's portrayed in most Texas histories. Even Mexican historians have had a hard time figuring him out. He is enigmatic. But he's enigmatic, I think, because we think of political leaders in sort of ideological terms. We assume they have policies. We assume they have ideology. We assume that there are political goals that they are interested in. Santa Anna is unlike any of his contemporaries. And he's a lot like Andrew Jackson, who's unlike his contemporaries. He's just a backcountry military figure. And he doesn't have policies. He's very ideologically flexible. But he has friends and he has enemies, and he acts accordingly. And if you want to understand why he does what he does, you just simply have to figure out who are his friends and enemies at any given point in time. And his relationship with Zavala is a fascinating one, because they're really good friends in the early 20s. They are responsible for overthrowing the election results in 1828. And they write letters to each other, praising each other to the skies. And then they have a falling out, and Zavala goes into exile, and he goes to the United States, marries an American woman, puts his kid in an American boarding school, does deals with American businessmen. But friends pave the way for a reconciliation. He comes back in the early 30s. And so they're friends again. And they, in 33, I think, doesn't matter. 33, Zavala is sent to France to be the minister, the Mexican minister to France. And it's there where he learns that Santa Anna has essentially torn up the Constitution of 1824 and installed a more centralist, a more conservative government. And Zavala, who did have principles, political principles, who did have an ideology, is absolutely furious. And he writes a letter to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he resigns. There's nothing for me to do here. I can't work for this government. It's a very tactful letter, but then he writes another letter that same day. And he sends it to the opposition newspapers in Mexico City. And he absolutely rips Santa Anna. And he says, "You've torn the Constitution to pieces." And he's immediately recalled. And Zavala says, "Well, thank you, but I'm not going to go back to Mexico City," because he is so antagonized the government, he really doesn't know what future awaits him there. So he says, "I'm going to go to Texas. I'm going to take up the life of the country squire." Nobody believes him in Mexico City, least of all Santa Anna, because he was a political animal, and they knew, they suspected, and they were correct in thinking that Zavala was going to go to Texas and he was going to try to establish a revolution to overthrow the Santa Anna regime. And that's what he does. Goes to New Orleans, meets with friends who've been sent into exile as well, and they hatch this big plan, which requires Zavala to go to Texas. And he arrives in the summer of 35, a few months before the revolution breaks out. And when he arrives, there is, the Mexican government finds out very quickly, and the military commander in San Antonio is writing down to the governor in Saltillo or Monclova, two different capitals. Mexico City learns a few weeks later. Santa Anna learns a few weeks after that on his hacienda in Veracruz. And it's then that the Mexican government decides that it's going to launch this massive campaign into Texas. And it's not because of what the Anglo-Americans were doing, because the Anglo-Americans in the late summer, early fall, hadn't really decided what they wanted to do. And so if you want to understand why this army begins to mobilize in the fall of 35 and begins to sort of march northward and arrive in February of 36, it's because of what they thought Zavala was doing, not what the Anglo-Americans were doing. If you go down to the Alamo, I was at the Alamo last month, and they still have these panels, and when you take the tour, they said, well, you know, the Mexican government decided to raise an army after December, after fighting in San Antonio in 35. Well, you know, that doesn't really make any sense, because the Mexican army I don't want to get into the weeds here on, on the military side of things, but that army, Mexican government was bankrupt, and it required 2 loans before it could even begin to organize. One of them required an act of Congress. Then you had to conscript men into the army, and you had to train men. It wasn't a question of weeks, it was a question of months. It took a long time for this army to, for the decision to be made and for the army to move north. And so if you're a traditionalist, and I'm speaking to those people who do, hew to that traditional view, you would want to know, why does that army show up in the winter of 36, not in the spring as everyone thought it would? What is the president of Mexico doing leading that army? It's because Santa Anna is bent on capturing Lorenzo de Zavala and bringing him back to Mexico City in chains. Now, as he moves northward, it becomes clear that Zavala wasn't in charge after all, because when he got to Texas, Texans did not want to put him in charge of a rebellion. They were more interested in a rebellion on their own. And so he is an important figure, but not a major player in the events that lead to the Texas Revolution. He's an ally of Stephen F. Austin and so on. But he's not a major player. But that doesn't, the fact remains that the Mexican government, when it made the decision to march north, assumed that he was in charge. After the siege of the Alamo, army pushes west, the Mexican army pushes east to the Brazos. It's about this time of the year, and it was raining, and the Brazos was about a mile wide, and they couldn't get across. And Santa Anna was one of the first, and there were a few regiments who had already made this ferry crossing. But most of the army was still on the west side of the Brazos. And he finds something out that he did not know, and that is that, he did know that the Texas Army was just to his north, but he also learned there on the east side of the banks of the Brazos that Zavala was moving west. Zavala had been elected as the vice president of Texas at the convention at Washington on the Brazos. And so the government, and by government, it was really Zavala and the president Burnett on 2 mules heading east to Harrisburg. That was the Texas government. And he takes a quarter of the army and takes off, heads after the government. Why does he do that? I think we know why. Because Zavala is there, because he wants to bring Zavala back to Mexico City in chains. And that is the army, albeit with some reinforcements. But that is the army that is defeated at San Jacinto. If you thought that Sam Houston defeated the Mexican army at San Jacinto, well, that's really not true. He defeats a quarter of the army. The other 3/4 is still trying to get across the Brazos River. And so Zavala is important, and we have totally ignored him. He gets a mention because he did agree to serve as vice president of the Texas Republic, and he was vice president for about 6 months, but that's really about it. We don't talk about his relationship with Santa Anna. We don't talk about his importance in understanding the Texas Revolution and the outcome of the Texas Revolution. And if you are in any doubt about how we have ignored him, then I'm going to give you Exhibit A. I don't have Exhibit B, so this better do. Back in the 70s, John Jenkins compiled all of the letters he could find about the Texas Revolution. It's a mammoth collection. It's 12 volumes. The 12th volume is the index. Volumes 1 through 11 are all the letters written that pertain to the revolt. If Austin wrote a letter, it's in there. If Austin received a letter, it's in there. If Austin's mentioned in the letter, it's in there. And if you want to know those letters that refer to Austin, you look under A in volume 12. Houston, under H. Okay, you go to the index and you look up the letters in which they wrote, received, or are mentioned. You can't write a book about the Texas Revolution without consulting John Jenkins' Papers of the Texas Revolution. If you go to the last page of volume 12, and you want to know about Zavala, this is what you see. Zavala Lorenzo Day, and Zavala's name is misspelled, so that should be a tip-off right there. But that's what you see. Too numerous to list. Well, there are a lot of letters, but we just can't be bothered to tell you where they are. And I was talking to a friend of mine who teaches at UNT, and I said, do you believe this? What is going on here? And he said, well, Zavala's name began with the letter Z, so maybe by the time Jenkins got to the Z's, he just said, oh, I'm done. I shipped this thing off to the publisher. And I thought, okay, that makes a weird kind of sense. But if the father of Texas, if his name began with a Z, all his letters would be in volume 12. If Houston's, the man who defeated Santa Anna at San Jacinto, if his name began with the letter Z, you could look up all his letters in the index, but not Lorenzo de Zavala. He is absolutely essential to understand the Texas Revolution. How have we missed this? How is it possible, after scores, if not hundreds of books about the Texas Revolution, how did we miss the fact that Santa Anna and Lorenzo de Zavala had this intense relationship, on again, off again, alliance, and then rivalry? And the answer is pretty simple, I'm afraid. It's because Anglo-American historians have made this story all about us. We focused on what William Baird Travis is doing, focused on what Jim Bowie is doing, focused on what Sam Houston is doing. This is a Mexican story before it becomes an American one. It kind of morphs into an American story, it's true, but it starts off as a Mexican story. And you can't understand it without getting into the weeds of Mexican politics in the 1820s and understand the relationship between Zavala and ultimately his nemesis, Santa Anna. And let me just stop for a second, because I do have one more. Am I doing okay? Okay. I was talking to a businessman from San Antonio, and this was a few months ago, he just bought the book, and he said, okay, I get it. You know, we do need to sort of update that narrative. But I really do miss the gripping saga of the Texas Revolution. And I don't remember what I told him, but what I probably told him was, I'm a historian. It's not my job to entertain you. I'm sure I said that really, tactfully, because he was being very nice about it. I said, yeah, I get it. But, I'm a historian. I'm just trying to tell the story as I see it. But then I thought about it after a while, and I thought, it is true. I mean, we have made the Texas Revolution this sort of gripping yarn. But these stories are interesting too. And the story of this obscure Cherokee leader trying to create this Indian empire in the forests of East Texas, that is an amazing story that we've ignored. And the relationship between Zavala and Santa Anna, that too is an amazing story. And it's not done, by the way. I don't have time to go into this either. But of course, spoiler alert, Santa Anna does not bring Lorenzo de Zavala back to Mexico in chains. He's defeated and humiliated at San Jacinto. And 2 days later, Lorenzo de Zavala arrives. And his first impulse is, he agrees entirely with the Texas Army. He must be executed on the spot. But Sam Houston prevails. And later Zavala says, I shouldn't have said that. It was the heat of the moment, and Houston was right. But then in the next few months, if you know your Texas history, you know that Santa Anna is a prisoner in Texas, and not treated well. And Zavala takes pity on him. And after a few weeks along the Brazos, who should show up at the cabin where he's being incarcerated? Lorenzo de Zavala. He brings fresh food, and they have dinner about twice a week, and they become really good friends again. So that is an amazing story too. So I guess the point that I'm making is, we think about this sort of gripping saga, and I would argue that we need to sort of look at that in conjunction with other stories, which are equally fascinating and exciting and dramatic. All right, one more, and this is not as sort of a gripping story, really. This is simply a more theoretical one, I guess. What do we call this? What do we call it? The Texas Revolution? Everybody calls it the Texas Revolution. But scholars, at least the serious ones, have kind of recoiled at that idea because they said, well, is it really a revolution? Are we really going to call it the Texas Revolution? Because are we going to put it on the same level as the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution or the American Revolution? And a historian at SMU back in the 80s who influenced just about anybody who's writing in the field today, David Weber, said, it's really not. This just looks like more manifest destiny to me. It's not really a social upheaval. And so when I started the book, I was very influenced by David and that view that this really wasn't a revolution. I called it the War of Secession. I called it a revolt, lowercase r, but I didn't want to call it the Texas Revolution. Although my publisher said, you can call it whatever you want in the book. We're calling it the Texas Revolution on the cover because that's what it sells. And I said, fine, but I didn't want to call it the Texas Revolution. I was midway through the book when I realized, you know what? This is a revolution, and let's just call it that. And the reason is because when historians focus on the Texas Revolution, they just think about this 6 months from Gonzales to San Jacinto. And white rule before that in Texas and after that doesn't change too much. It actually changes in some important ways, but time's not going to allow me to talk about them. The Texas Republic is actually politically the Texas Constitution of 1836 is a very radical document, but I don't have time to go into that. But we've never really taken into account what happens to everybody else. And if we're going to tell the story of Texas with everybody in it, Tejanos, indigenous peoples, Native American refugees, African Americans, Africans from the Niger River Delta, if we're going to tell that story, then it is a dramatic political and social upheaval, because for just about everybody, with the exception of the white government, that the Texas Republic changes their lives in a seismic way. I don't have time to go into it. We've already talked about the immigrant tribes that meet with Houston in the mid-1840s at Bird's Fort. Those people have been, I don't know if you know this, but at Bird's Fort, when they came, some of these people weren't even in Texas. Some of the tribes had already fled above the Red River and came down for the treaty. They were essentially gone because they had been expelled by Lamar in 1839. I have a chapter, and I spend one chapter dedicated to a man, but I refer to him throughout, named William Goyens, Goyens. I don't have a picture of him either, sorry. But he is a free black businessman in Nacogdoches. And in the 20s, in the Mexican period, he has an inn in town. He has a carting business, and he ships furs and hides from Nacogdoches to Natchitoches. He ends up building a grist mill and then a sawmill, and then a house on what the locals will refer to as Goyens Hill outside of town. He's one of the richest men, if not the richest, in Nacogdoches, and he is a free black man. He can vote, he doesn't run for office, but he campaigns for people who do. He can sue, and he can represent himself in court, and boy, he was litigious as hell, it turns out. And the only way you can find out about him is through the Nacogdoches court records. And then in 1836, the Texas Republic is formed, and William Goyens' world changes dramatically. Obviously, he can't vote. He's not a citizen. He still finds ways to sue people, but he has to pay for white lawyers to do that. In 1840, the Texas Congress passes a law saying that all free black men and women must leave. And if you want to be exempt from that rule, that expulsion law, then you have to have a law passed by the Texas Congress. And Goins, because of his prominence, he is in no way typical of free blacks in Texas, but because of his prominence, he has friends like Sam Houston, Thomas Jefferson Rusk, big movers and shakers in East Texas. And they pass a law on his behalf. And the Texas Congress says, yes, Goins can stay. And so my problem with this thesis that, well, it's not really a revolution, is that we've just focused on that traditional narrative and that traditional population. I really wanted to write in Unsettled Land a revisionist history, but not even that. I wouldn't even call it a revisionist history. I think my feeling was we have focused on one segment of this population and only that segment for about 125 years. And so let's now look at everybody who lived there and see what kind of story we get. And the story we get is vastly different from that story that we are still to this day telling seventh graders in their Texas history classes. We just simply, if there's a takeaway from my talk, it's that we can't just shoehorn the experiences of people of color into that traditional narrative. We have to look at the experiences of everyone and really come up with an entirely new narrative that tells the story of Texas with everyone in it. Okay? All right, I was really rushing because I thought I was pressed for time, but those are the three things. What do we get when we adopt a wide lens? I think in many ways we get a far richer story and that we need to be telling, far richer than the traditional narrative that we knew in the 20th century. Thanks very much. I appreciate it.
Anyone have any questions?
What was the reason that all the Native Americans came to Texas?
Oh, okay, that's a great question. And the answer is pretty simple, although you have to look at each one of them individually, but they all have the same experience. They were ceding their lands to federal and sometimes state authorities. Okay? Now, if you're a little bit fuzzy on the chronology here, everyone's heard of the Trail of Tears. Trail of Tears doesn't happen till 39. That's the year that Lamar expels them. We haven't spent enough time talking about the slow, steady migration of these, I call them refugees because that's what they are. They were supposed to go to Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma, but if you know the Trail of Tears, you know that federal troops escorted the Cherokees west. In the teens and the 20s, and in much of the 30s, these Indian tribes ceded their land, and what happened to them after that, people gave very little thought to. The assumption was they'd go to Indian Territory. They were just said, point that away, and off you go. But because there was no one to stop them, some of them didn't even go into Indian Territory first. Some of them just simply went straight west into East Texas because there were no Mexican troops, there was no Mexican population. Some went to Indian Territory first. Bowls and Fields were in Indian Territory in the teens. Yeah, above the Red River. I mean, we're talking about people from all over. The Shawnees and the Delaware are from Kansas, and they're from the Great Lakes. The Cherokees are from Georgia, North Carolina, and Texas. Alabama, Coushatta from the lower south. Chickasaws, Choctaws, lower south. So they're coming from all over. But the reason is essentially the same. They have ceded their land, and they have moved west, and they are now expected to move west. Yeah.
What kind of primary or first sources do you find for some of that native activity?
Yeah, it's really hard. So, yeah, that's a great question. And one of the things that was really helpful for me was that there has not been a lot written on the Cherokees. There was a book written I think in the 80s. A friend of mine who was at UNT until he just retired had had studied, had done some work on it. But you really have to use Spanish archival resources, Mexican archival resources. But and those have been used before. But what I found was that just before I started writing the book, I found a lot about Fields because he had served as a translator to Moravian missionaries back in Tennessee. And the Moravians kept great correspondence and letters and diaries. And he was their translator. And although I didn't have a picture of Fields, they thought he was kind of a hoot. And they described him in detail. They said, you know, he was, they weren't so sure that he was a very good Christian, but he was a very good translator. And he accompanied them throughout, from Cherokee village to Cherokee village with these Moravian missionaries. But you're right, you're not going to find Native American sources unless they are secondhand from Spanish, Mexican, or Anglo authorities. That's just simply a fact. That's a good question.
Where do we get the book?
Amazon.
Oh, you don't have it with you?
I didn't. No one told me I was supposed to. I don't think that I've never gone.
Salesman are you?
I've never. Well, I was never told, and I've never brought a cache of books. I mean, if I brought my publisher would probably charge you more than you'd get it on Amazon for. And if you went to Amazon, you can get it in a day. So that's what I would do. All right. Thanks.